What truly happens when we take our last breath? Is it the end of the story, a blank page where everything ceases to exist? Or is it the beginning of an entirely new chapter, something beyond our wildest imaginations? For centuries, humanity has wrestled with this mystery. Some see death as a curtain falling, while others believe it's a doorway opening. Across cultures and civilizations, stories have emerged to explain this profound transition. Yet, few accounts are as detailed and mesmerizing as those found in the Bardo Zrenia Tibetan Book of the Dead. This ancient text doesn't just whisper about life after death, it maps it out. It's a spiritual compass, pointing us toward understanding the journey the soul takes once it departs the body. If you've ever wondered what lies beyond or felt an inexplicable yearning to understand the mysteries of existence, this guide could offer answers. But it's not merely about curiosity. It's about preparation. The lessons found within its pages can transform the way we view not just death, but life itself. Imagine a roadmap that doesn't end where the heart stops beating, but extends into the unknown. What if you could navigate the afterlife, avoid getting lost in fear and confusion, and possibly reach liberation? The Bardo Thodol invites us to explore the unknown, not as fearful wanderers, but as enlightened travelers. This journey isn't just for scholars or monks. It's for anyone who dares to ask, what happens next? The Bardo Thodol is far more than a religious text. It is a spiritual guide designed to help the soul during its most vulnerable state, the transition from life to death. Written over 1,000 years ago, it offers profound insights into the mysterious process of dying and what follows. In Tibetan Buddhism, death is not seen as an end, but as a transition, a sacred moment filled with potential. It is a time when the soul is unshackled from the body, free to experience its purest essence. But with freedom comes challenges, as the soul is faced with visions and choices that determine its next chapter, liberation or rebirth. What makes this text so remarkable is its practical application. It wasn't written for monks alone, but for everyone. In fact, the teachings were often recited by family members or spiritual guides as someone approached their final moments. The goal? To help the dying recognize the signs and opportunities for enlightenment. The word Bardo itself means intermediate state, referring to the transitional phases between death and rebirth. According to the Bardo Zrenia, there are 3 such states: the Chikai Bardo Zrenia, the moment of death; the Chonyid Bardo Zrenia; each Sidpa Bardo, Logos, where the soul prepares for rebirth. Each stage presents unique challenges and opportunities, but they all share one common truth. The mind is at its most powerful during these transitions. Free from the distractions of the physical body, the mind encounters its true nature, something that can be both liberating and terrifying. By understanding these teachings, the living can prepare for the inevitable. The Bardo Thodol isn't just about what happens after death. It's about how to live with awareness, compassion, and clarity. It reminds us that every moment, even our final breath, holds the potential for awakening. The origins of the Bardo Thodol are as fascinating as its teachings. This sacred text is attributed to Padmasambhava, one of the most revered figures in Tibetan Buddhism. Known as the Precious Guru or Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava wasn't an ordinary monk. He was a spiritual pioneer, a mystic and a master of esoteric practices. Born in India during the 8th century, his journey to Tibet wasn't just a geographical move. It was a transformative mission to unify spiritual traditions and elevate human consciousness. At the time, Tibet was a land rich with spiritual diversity, but also rife with tension. The Bon religion, a deeply rooted indigenous belief system, thrived alongside animist practices and shamanic rituals. While these traditions held profound wisdom, their coexistence with Buddhism often led to resistance and conflict. When King Trisong Detsen of Tibet sought to establish Buddhism as the country's spiritual foundation, he turned to Padmasambhava for help. Padmasambhava's arrival in Tibet wasn't met with open arms. He faced opposition not only from political factions, but also from the spiritual forces of the Bon tradition. Legend has it that he encountered powerful deities and spirits who resisted the spread of Buddhism. Yet, instead of eradicating these forces, Padmasambhava used his mastery of tantric rituals to transform them. He integrated their energies into the Buddhist framework, ensuring that the wisdom of the Bon tradition was preserved rather than destroyed. This act of unification was groundbreaking. It laid the foundation for Tibetan Buddhism as we know it today, a unique blend of spiritual practices that embraces both the transcendental and the earthly. Padmasambhava's teachings didn't just stop at bridging traditions, they delved deep into the nature of existence itself. The Bardo Thodol emerged from Padmasambhava's understanding of the human journey. He believed that the mind, when unencumbered by the body, had the power to recognize its true essence, but he also understood the challenges souls face during this process. Fear, attachment, and ignorance often cloud the mind, preventing it from embracing the light of liberation. To guide souls through this delicate phase, he composed the teachings of the Bardo Thodol. More than just a guide for the dead, it was a gift to the living. Padmasambhava knew that by contemplating these teachings, individuals could transform their approach to life, cultivating a sense of peace and purpose that would carry them through to their final moments. His compassion for humanity is evident in every word of the text, which serves as both a warning and a promise that even in the most uncertain times, there is a path to freedom. Through the Bardo Thodol, Swing Padmasambhava's legacy continues to inspire seekers around the world. His teachings remind us that the journey of the soul is not confined to any single tradition or belief system. It is universal, a reflection of the timeless quest for truth that lies at the heart of every human experience. In Tibetan Buddhism, the moment of death is not seen as a final destination, but rather as the beginning of a profound journey. The Chikai Bardo, or the Bardo of the moment of death, is the first stage in this transition. It is during this phase that the soul separates from the physical body and encounters the clear light, Swing, a radiant and pure manifestation of ultimate truth. This is a moment of immense spiritual significance, as it offers a rare opportunity for liberation. The clear light is described as dazzling and all-encompassing, yet it is not something external. It is the essence of the soul itself, the truest and most unfiltered state of consciousness. In this moment, there is no duality, no fear, no attachment, no identity. For those who are prepared, this encounter can lead to immediate liberation, a merging with the infinite that transcends the cycles of birth and death. But for many, the intensity of the clear light can be overwhelming. The soul, untrained in recognizing its essence, may retreat in fear or confusion. Imagine standing before a mirror that reflects your deepest truth. If you've spent your life avoiding that truth, the experience can be terrifying. Instead of embracing the light, the soul clings to familiar illusions, losing the chance for liberation and moving on to the next stages of the Bardo. The teachings of the Bardo Thodol emphasize that preparation for this moment begins in life. By practicing mindfulness, meditation, and detachment, we train our minds to recognize the clear light as part of our own nature. It's not about achieving perfection, but about cultivating awareness. The Chikai Bardo reminds us that the way we live shapes the way we die. Every choice, every attachment, and every moment of clarity contributes to how we will navigate this critical phase. For those accompanying the dying, the Bardo Thodol offers guidance on how to recite specific prayers and instructions. These rituals are not mere formalities. They serve as a compass for the soul, helping it to stay focused on the light, rather than being distracted by fear or attachment. In Tibetan culture, the recitation of these teachings is a sacred act of love and compassion, a final gift to the departing soul. As the soul moves beyond the Chikai Bardo, Zrenya Chonyid Bardo, Zrenya, the Bardo of visions. This is a realm where the mind's projections come to life with astonishing clarity. Free from the physical body, the mind becomes a canvas, and its accumulated fears, desires, and attachments paint vivid images that the soul must confront. The Chonyid Bardo is often described as a dreamlike state, but it is far more intense and lucid than any ordinary dream. Here, the soul encounters two types of visions, peaceful and wrathful. The peaceful visions appear first, manifesting as serene deities, bodhisattvas, or radiant figures that embody the soul's enlightened qualities. These beings radiate calmness and offer a sense of peace, reminding the soul of its potential for awakening. However, even these peaceful visions can be overwhelming for an unprepared mind. The soul may struggle to accept their reality or doubt its worthiness to embrace such divine energy. If the soul cannot recognize the peaceful visions as part of its own nature, it moves on to the next phase, wrathful visions. The wrathful visions are not external demons or malevolent forces. They are reflections of the soul's unresolved emotions, fears, and karmic tendencies. These figures can appear monstrous and terrifying, embodying everything the soul has suppressed or avoided in life. But the Bardo teaches that even these frightening images are opportunities for liberation. By recognizing them as mere projections of the mind, the soul can dissolve their power and move closer to enlightenment. This stage is both a challenge and a gift. It forces the soul to confront its inner reality without filters or distractions. The peaceful and wrathful visions serve as mirrors, reflecting the soul's true state. For those who can maintain awareness through Chonyid, Bardo is a gateway to liberation. But for those who succumb to fear or attachment, the cycle of samsara continues. The teachings of the Bardo encourage spiritual practice during life to prepare for this stage. Meditation, self-reflection, and the cultivation of compassion help the mind develop clarity and resilience. By understanding that all phenomena, including the visions of the Chonyid Bardo, component placement are empty in nature, we can face them with equanimity. The Sidpa Bardo, component placement, the Bardo of becoming, marks the final stage of the journey. Here, the soul stands at the threshold of rebirth, guided by the karmic forces it has accumulated throughout its existence. This phase is often described as a psychic storm, a whirlwind of desires and fears that pulls the soul toward its next life. In the Sidpa Bardo, Zrania, the soul experiences an intense longing for a new body. This desire is not a conscious choice but an instinctive pull shaped by karmic tendencies. Imagine a magnet drawing iron filings. It's a process that feels inevitable, yet it is deeply influenced by the soul's inner state. The Bardo teaches that this is a critical moment where awareness and detachment can still lead to liberation. The visions in this stage often include symbolic imagery, such as couples in union, representing the creation of new life. The soul, influenced by its karmic imprints, is drawn to certain circumstances that align with its unresolved lessons and tendencies. For example, a soul carrying anger may be reborn into a life where it faces similar challenges, offering an opportunity to resolve this emotion. But the Sidpa Bardo is not just about rebirth, it is also about choice. The teachings emphasize that with enough awareness, the soul can resist the pull of karmic forces and achieve liberation instead. This requires a deep understanding of the nature of desire and fear, as well as the ability to see through the illusions of the mind. For spiritual practitioners, the Sidpa Bardo represents the culmination of their efforts. A life spent cultivating detachment, compassion, and mindfulness prepares the soul to navigate this stage with clarity. Instead of being swept away by the storm, they can recognize the visions as fleeting and empty, choosing liberation over rebirth. The Bardo offers practical guidance for this stage, encouraging meditation on the concept of shunyata, or emptiness. By understanding that all experiences are impermanent and without inherent reality, the soul can maintain its focus on the clear light. Component placement, transcending the cycle of samsara. The Sidpa Bardo is a profound reminder of the interconnectedness of life and death. It teaches that every action, thought, and intention shapes not only our present life, but also the journey that follows. By living with awareness and intention, we can influence not just our future, but the very essence of our being. Life and death are not opposites, they are part of the same continuum. The Bardo teaches that the experiences we cultivate in life directly influence our journey after death. Death is not an isolated event, but the culmination of our choices, thoughts, and actions. To navigate the Bardo successfully, preparation must begin long before the final breath. In life, our attachments, fears, and desires often dictate how we perceive the world. These same tendencies shape how the soul reacts in the Bardos. If we live with clarity, awareness, and compassion, the transition after death becomes smoother, filled with opportunities for liberation. On the other hand, a life consumed by greed, anger, or ignorance binds the soul, creating obstacles in the journey. Meditation is a cornerstone of this preparation. By sitting in silence and observing the mind, we learn to detach from the constant flow of thoughts and emotions. This detachment is crucial in the Bardos, where the soul must recognize visions and projections as fleeting and empty. Tibetan Buddhists often meditate on death itself, not as a morbid fascination, but as a way to cultivate acceptance and readiness. Beyond meditation, cultivating virtues such as compassion, forgiveness, and gratitude can transform the soul. Compassion connects us to others, helping us release selfish desires. Forgiveness frees us from the burdens of resentment. Gratitude shifts our focus from what we lack to what we have. These practices prepare the mind to embrace the clear light and move toward liberation when the time comes. The Bardo Thodol reminds us that the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the ability to face life and death with peace. Life is a training ground, an opportunity to practice letting go. Every moment offers a choice, to cling or to release, to fear or to love. These choices shape not just our current experience, but our eternal journey. Central to the Bardo Thodol is the concept of shunyata, zrenya. This teaching is not about nihilism, but about recognizing that everything we experience, thoughts, emotions, objects, even life and death, is devoid of inherent, fixed reality. Understanding shunyata is key to navigating the Bardos, where illusions and projections can trap the soul. In the Chonyid Bardo, зрение, мирное и гневное видение являются продуктами ума, а не внешними реальностями. Similarly, in the Sidpa Bardo, logically, the pull toward rebirth arises from desires and fears that are ultimately empty in nature. The soul's liberation depends on its ability to see through these illusions and embrace the truth of emptiness. Think of a shunyata as the space between thoughts. It is the stillness that remains when everything else fades. In this space, there is no attachment, no aversion, no separation. It is the essence of the clear light, zrenya, ultimate truth that the Bardo Thodol encourages us to recognize. Understanding shunyata begins in life. By observing how everything changes, relationships, possessions, even our own bodies, we see that clinging to permanence is futile. This realization is not meant to create despair, but to inspire freedom. When we stop clinging, we begin to experience life more fully, appreciating each moment for what it is, rather than what we wish it to be. In the Bardos, the ability to recall shunyata acts as an anchor. It prevents the soul from being swept away by fear or desire. It allows the soul to remain calm, even in the face of overwhelming visions. This calmness opens the door to liberation, where the cycle of rebirth no longer binds the soul. The Bardos are not just about death, they are a mirror for life itself. Every fear, attachment, or desire we encounter in the Bardos is a reflection of what we carry within us during life. The Bardo Thodol teaches that the journey after death is a continuation of the journey we are already on. In life, we often avoid confronting our fears or embracing our true nature. We distract ourselves with material pursuits, relationships, or entertainment, hoping to escape the discomfort of self-reflection. But in the Bardos, there is no escape. The soul must face itself directly with no illusions to hide behind. This confrontation is not a punishment, but an opportunity. It forces the soul to acknowledge its strengths and weaknesses, to integrate what has been repressed, and to move toward wholeness. Similarly, in life, every challenge we face is an opportunity for growth. Every difficulty is a mirror, showing us where we need to heal or evolve. The Bardo Thodol invites us to approach life with the same awareness and courage that the soul must summon in the Bardos. By confronting our fears, releasing attachments, and cultivating compassion, we prepare ourselves not only for death, but for a richer, more meaningful existence. Imagine living each day as if it were a Bardo, a moment of transition filled with potential. This perspective shifts our focus from fear to possibility, from clinging to letting go. It reminds us that the journey of the soul is not confined to death. It is happening here and now in every breath, in every choice. The Bardo Thodol offers more than answers about death. It offers profound wisdom about life. It teaches that death is not the end, but a transition, a portal that opens into new realms of existence. This portal is not just about what comes next, it is about how we approach the present moment. The ultimate question is not about what happens after we die, but about how we live before that moment arrives. Are we living with awareness, cultivating love, and letting go of what no longer serves us? Or are we clinging to illusions, letting fear dictate our choices and missing the beauty of the present? As Ram Dass once said, when you die, there is only one question that matters: how much did you love? This question echoes the teachings of the Bardo Thodol. Zrania remind us that life and death are intertwined, that every breath carries the potential for awakening. Let us not wait for the final moment to reflect on these truths. Let us begin now, embracing life with the same courage and clarity that the Bardo Thodol encourages in death. By preparing for the Bardos, we prepare for life itself, living with purpose, compassion, and an open heart. The journey of the soul is eternal, but the choices we make today shape the path we take. Death is not something to fear. It is a reminder to live fully. As we walk this path together, let us remember that the greatest mystery is not death, but the infinite possibilities of life.